Some hatreds do not fade with time. They fester. They curdle into obsession, passed down from one generation to the next, waiting for an opportunity to erupt into violence. AD, in the middle of the 2nd century BC, the Roman Republic, the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, was haunted by such a hatred. It's a ghost of a past war, and the ghost of one man, Hannibal Barca. For decades, one of Rome's most influential politicians, Cato the Elder, ended every speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the same 5 chilling words: Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. But why this obsession? The great wars with Carthage were over. Hannibal was defeated. Carthage itself was a shadow of its former self, a wealthy trading port, but militarily neutered and bound by a humiliating peace treaty. Why was Rome so consumed with the need to not just defeat but utterly annihilate its old foe? Welcome to the Histofy. Today, we explore the story of the Third Punic War, a conflict born not of necessity, but of cold, calculated, and vengeful extermination. To understand the final destruction of Carthage, we must understand the peace that preceded it. After their devastating defeat in the Second Punic War, Carthage was crippled by the terms of the Roman treaty. They were forced to give up their overseas territories, pay a massive war indemnity, and, most importantly, they were forbidden from waging war without the permission of the Roman Senate. This last clause was a diplomatic chain around their neck, and Rome's allies knew it. To the west of Carthage lay the kingdom of Numidia, ruled by the fiercely pro-Roman king Massinissa. For years, Massinissa, emboldened by his alliance with Rome, repeatedly raided and seized Carthaginian territory. He would encroach on their farmlands, sack their towns, and provoke their border guards. The Carthaginians, honoring their treaty, did not retaliate with force. Instead, they sent desperate diplomatic appeals to Rome. They begged the Senate to intervene, to restrain their Numidian ally. But in Rome, the political winds were blowing cold. The hardline faction, led by Cato the Elder, saw every Carthaginian plea not as a request for justice, but as a sign of their rivals' recovering strength. Cato had visited Carthage and had been horrified to see its markets thriving and its ports busy. He returned to Rome convinced that as long as the city of Carthage stood, it would remain a potential threat. So, the Senate ignored the appeals. For decades, Carthage endured the humiliation. But finally, around 151 BC, they could take no more. They raised a small army and launched a defensive campaign against the Numidian invaders. Militarily, the campaign was a disaster for Carthage. They were soundly defeated. But politically, it was a death sentence. They had technically violated the treaty. They had waged a war, albeit a defensive one, without Roman permission. And in Rome, Cato and his allies had the pretext they had been waiting for. The Senate voted. Rome would declare war. A massive Roman army, commanding over 80,000 men, landed in North Africa. The Carthaginian leaders, terrified, immediately surrendered. They sent ambassadors to the Roman consuls, offering to do anything to avoid another war with the superpower. The Romans issued their first demand. Carthage must hand over 300 children of their most noble families as hostages. Heartbroken, Carthage complied. Then, the Romans issued their second demand. Carthage must surrender every weapon within the city walls, every sword, every spear, every suit of armor, every catapult. Hoping to prove their peaceful intentions, Carthage complied. Wagon after wagon of weapons and armor were solemnly handed over to the Roman legions. The city was now completely disarmed. And it was then that the Roman consuls delivered their final, horrifying ultimatum. The Senate had decided that the city of Carthage itself must be abandoned. The entire population was to be relocated 10 miles inland, away from the sea that was their home, their history, and their lifeblood. In that moment, the Carthaginians understood. This was never about the treaty with Numidia. This was about annihilation. They had been tricked. Their grief and fear turned instantly to a white-hot rage. They executed the politicians who had advocated for peace, and they slammed the city gates shut. They chose to die in their homes rather than abandon them. What followed was a miracle of defiance. The entire city became a workshop of war. The citizens worked day and night to rearm themselves. They melted down statues and household pots to forge new swords and shields. The city's temples were turned into workshops for building siege engines. And in one of the most famous acts of defiance in history, the women of Carthage cut off their long hair to be woven into ropes for the catapults. The Romans, expecting a quick and easy occupation, were stunned. They launched an assault on the walls and were thrown back with heavy losses. The city that was supposed to surrender in a day held out. The siege of Carthage had begun. For nearly 3 years, the city resisted. The Roman campaign was plagued by incompetence and disease. But then, Rome sent a new commander, Scipio, Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the legendary Scipio Africanus, the man who had defeated Hannibal. Scipio was brilliant, ruthless, and disciplined. He tightened the blockade, building a massive mole to block the city's harbor. In a final, incredible feat of engineering, the Carthaginians dug a new canal to the sea and built a new fleet in secret. But it was too little too late. In the spring of 146 BC, Scipio launched the final assault. The final battle was not fought in the fields, but in the streets. For 6 days and 6 nights, the Roman legions fought their way through the city, house by house, in some of the most brutal urban warfare the ancient world had ever seen. The fighting was so intense that the Romans would clear a house, and then use its timbers to build bridges to the rooftops of the next house, fighting their way across the city from above, while the streets below were filled with fire and death. The last stand was at the citadel of Byrsa, the highest point in the city. When it finally fell, the remaining 50,000 Carthaginian citizens, a fraction of the city's original populations, surrendered and were immediately sold into slavery. But for Scipio and the Roman Senate, that was not enough. The city itself had to be erased. For the next several days, the legions systematically demolished what was left of Carthage, burning it to the ground until nothing remained but rubble and ash. There is a famous story that the Romans then plowed the fields and sowed them with salt, to curse the land and ensure that nothing would ever grow there again. While most modern historians believe this is a later invention, a dramatic embellishment, the legend survives because it perfectly captures the spirit of Rome's intention: total and complete eradication. The destruction of Carthage was a dark turning point for the Roman Republic. It was an act of genocide, driven not by a real threat, but by a deep-seated fear and a thirst for vengeance. It showed the world that Rome was no longer just a power to be negotiated with. It was a force of nature that would utterly consume anything and anyone it perceived as a rival. The ghost of Hannibal was finally laid to rest, but it came at the cost of a city, a people, and a piece of Rome's own soul. The ashes of Carthage would become the foundation upon which Rome would build its new, and far more brutal identity as a global empire. This was the Histofy. I'll see you in the next one.